Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I'm very happy to welcome you to our Žaliuoju podcast, which means going green. And we all go green over different things and for different reasons. Some people go green over social justice. Some people are inspired by sustainable business and human business practices. Some people are inspired by environmental wisdom. Some of us are all about grassroots democracy, and a lot of people can really identify with nonviolence. And today we were going to talk a little bit about green architecture and about humane architecture. And I'm very happy that today on the show we have Arthur Mamou, which is a friend I met at Burning Man, and then later found out that he designed the temple, which burned very beautifully some 2 years back. It was an amazing furnace, a vortex of flame and energy. And he's a guy that takes his architectural processes and tries to really focus them with a humane approach, and also looking at the sustainable side of things, how you produce things, how you scale things. His approach is holistic as far as I could tell, and he makes very beautiful things with very beautiful designs. And I'm very happy to welcome onto the show, Arthur.
Hello, Jurgis.
Hey,
thank you for the kind intro.
Yeah, man. I'm really happy to be talking to you, mostly because I'm a fan in the way that you really, when you construct something, when you build things, you're very considerate. A couple of days ago on the show, I had a friend which told me that you need to, when you eat food, you need to approach it with reverence and really try to analyze where everything came from, really take time to think about it. And some of the things that hurt me the most, say in an urban environment, is when I see that there are solutions that are implemented without care, without heart, without really considering nature or people. And so I would like to open this conversation by asking you about your holistic approach to architecture, and how you go about your business.
Yeah, I mean, what you say is key. The idea of being holistic in what we do. So I'm lucky enough to be a bit of a geek. So my dad was a computer scientist and taught me computer science, and I've discovered that there is in architecture a way to use the computer to create systems, and that architecture doesn't have to just come from, say, one's brain. It can also be developed a little bit like nature through developing interrelated parts. It might sound a bit like cryptic, but what I mean by that is when we design, it's not quite from the top down, but it's from the bottom up. So it comes from a machine that can 3D print with bioplastic, or it comes from a laser that can cut wood in a certain way. And we learn from the material, we learn from the machines, and we implement all this in algorithmic system in the computer. And it's, strangely enough, like the act of letting go of imposing something to the computer, but letting systems generate thing, brings us really much closer to nature. I always thought it was quite an interesting paradox that by using technology, you actually get closer to nature.
That's beautiful, because in what you do, there's a lot of biomimicry, and there's a lot of fractals involved.
Yeah.
And so tell me how that worked. Was that a process of revelation where you understood how technology was bringing you closer to nature, or was it something that just became very apparent over the years?
I think my the first time that I got confronted with this is when I was in middle school, and we were being taught there was this little turtle that would move around. It was called Logo. It was a way to learn coding, and you were giving the turtle little indications of where to go, like and then you let the turtle do its thing. So you and they trace the path of the turtle, and so what was really beautiful is by giving the turtle just simple instruction, it would generate the most stunning fractal-like, galaxy-like, golden ratio-like trajectories. And I stayed after hours. I remember staying till like quite late, just playing with that turtle. The fact that instead of drawing something, you could generate it, I think that was a big revelation at that moment. But I didn't realize it was an entire movement when I came to London to study architecture here. It was called generative design or parametric design, and so this was amazing, because it would mean that that turtle could actually create structures and architecture.
That's very interesting, because I'm not an architect, and I have an appreciation for architecture. So you'll have to have a little bit of patience with
No
me,
worries at all.
if I say something stupid. But it's very interesting how, especially when we talk about working with cement, and you talk about concrete. I mean, that's something that lasts for hundreds, and if it's well done, it lasts for thousands of years, right? And in many examples, it was all about creating monumental spaces that people would remember, and little by little, we're moving more towards human design. And it's very curious, because a lot of, say, of the bigger or I don't know, more important European cities are very monumental, but they lack a lot of green spaces and this. How did that evolution, in architecture occurred? Is it like kind of like with culinary, kind of like, with food, where people just said, "Oh, this is a natural way for us to evolve," or has there been a lot of internal pushback by different architectural schools on the way we should do things? And I started thinking about Le Corbusier, and and how some people love him, some people hate him, and then I think you worked with Hadid as well. Is that right? At some point. So for me, this is a very interesting thing: the evolution of how you balance aesthetics, monumental structures, and the human element.
I think people sort of saw nature as something to dominate, for a very long time. And they always had this notion of the creator, the creator out there that, made the human like superior to the rest. And, we took them on the boat, we saved them, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a real top-down notion of creation, which we slowly kind of contravene with the notion that maybe it was all based on mutations and natural evolution, and the fact that maybe what we're seeing out there just self-adjusted to the environment and to many, many parameters through billions of years. And it's hard to let go when you're an architect, to think that nature has solved itself through mutations and adaptation, because as an architect, you tend to think like, I can create, I can have a vision coming from the sky, and it's like the ego is at play, and I think it's hard to let go of that, and a lot of people reject algorithmic design because it means losing control, and I think the same with nature. But I always find it so humbling to walk in a park or to walk in a forest, to see how complex nature is, how incredibly resilient, and how it can disappear, reappear. Like, our buildings are not thought through as cyclical thing. Like, we don't necessarily think of the deconstruction of a building. We only think, you talked about burning the temple, but that was a really nice way to think, well, the project was, we knew that it would be burned, and we knew that we had to recycle all the parts, and we knew that there was an afterlife to it, and that we had to plan that afterlife. And in a way, the idea of circular economy is all about that. It's where does things come from, but also where do they go? What happens to them at the end? And so, yeah, I think we were very disconnected to nature, even on a theoretical, philosophical level. But that's changing. So it's slowly changing. I hope we can change it.
I hope so. I mean, actually, that's my next question, because it's very beautiful when you have architects, scientists, politicians, people all over the board who start to really understand that conscientiousness is one of the most important things in this kind of global transformation. I think a lot of us are aspiring to, and humility is a big part of it, really understanding that, yeah, we can dominate, but we can also be the apex healer rather than the apex predator. We can be the gardener rather than just the taker from nature. And that's an internal shift. And so my question is, in metropolitan spaces which have already been defined and which have their own heritage, like Paris, like Vilnius, how do we make that transition? How do we respect the old and kind of bring in the new, I'm sure you've encountered all kinds of pushback as well with your designs because they're quite radical. And also, tell me about that. How do we make that transition?
Number one, I think people might not accept external architecture or contemporary architecture, but they might accept nature next to them. So I think it makes it easier for us as architects if we try and do architecture as much natural as we can. What I mean by that is, for example, we've just placed tomato crops outside, and we've placed them in bioplastic pots and etc. And that has kind of stayed, and no one came to tell us off. And when you think of streets like Paris, I grew up in Paris, and so I know what it is to be in a city that seems like it will never change. But there is space, cars are slowly disappearing, and it will leave all these parking lots free. So that's the first thing to do, is to re-engage with the parking spaces and to replace them with, tree houses or things like this, where we have a blur between the natural environment and the architectural environment. And then there's the air. There's the space in the sky that, has been completely, we thought we'd have flying cars, etc., but we never got to it. But why don't we just start looking at alternate way of circulating? Because if we're going to get rid of the cars, we can't just think that people will just magically find other means of transportation. And so I really think that this transition of switching transportation to the air whilst re-inhabiting the ground will be a crucial transition that we need to think of.
That's a beautiful idea. Obviously, there's another possibility that we'll all be stuck in our homes.
Yeah, but that's good. I mean, virtual reality is a way to get out of the home without, going out of the home. And then so that's another revolution that I see coming, that the idea of the metaverse, the idea that the internet will be a physical space in which we can meet, in which we can physically be together without necessarily traveling and taking carbon-consuming planes, etc.
But this is we're touching on something very interesting, where actually you're applying a lot of the principles of design thinking to tackling very concrete problems. I mean, very often here in Vilnius, we may be a couple of steps back from what some people would consider to be modern Europe. But very often I've seen things happen in the city where somebody has given poor technical specifications, or that the assignment is poorly put together. I say, in this small space where we shouldn't have anything, let's put something here. Why? Because somebody said this and that. And then what you need is a very flexible brain to solve these solutions, rather than just offer the first thing that comes off your head. A lot of creativity. And so let me ask you about the creative process in architecture, maybe very personal, how you work in the studio, and what you would suggest to other architects which really want to bring more of that conscientiousness, because sometimes you need to take technical specifications and look at them from a completely different angle. So
there is a few things that we do here that is, I think, relatively different. One is we have the machines that we use to make things in-house. So that means that we have a giant 3D printer here, we have giant laser cutters. And what that means is we can experiment live with the output. As opposed to just give specification, we actually make the systems. And that means that we can go against the flow of, specification is often just choosing from products that were already been conceived, that are already stamped, already certified, but also are controlled by a certain amount of big corporations. And there's no interest for them to innovate or reinvent, because they've got their systems, it's approved by the government, and just specify, make money. For us, it's beyond that. For us, the value of something is also environmental. So it's not just the financial value. We're not trying to make money. That's not our core interest. The core interest is to take into consideration the environmental cost of things. So when we design, we try and minimize waste, for example. So we think, okay, what's the product that nature would give us that would be the least wasteful as possible? And so that's really, really important. So there are tools like life cycle analysis that you can use to measure all this. But it's really important to be in power of the means of production to do that. So having your own machines, having your access to your own materials, dealing with the supplier of the materials, knowing that our bioplastic would be grown from sugar canes that are not done unethically. Like we open a can of worms, and there's a big can of worms behind every material. So the more you have access to the worms, the better.
Yeah. Man, but that's really amazing what you're telling me, because it's very beautiful. Again, like when you in your website it says that you use a holistic approach to what you do. You're not lying, it's completely being very conscientious. And so I think the prototyping angle is very important. The processes, right? What the inputs, outputs are. And I really like what you were talking about, the materials, and how there's industries and there's complete bureaucratic and business systems which are vested in certain outcomes being met in a certain way. Yeah. In Lithuania, we have a term called trinkelizacija. And trinkelizacija is how they've taken like very standard kind of like concrete slabs or tiles, and they've basically put it everywhere where the architect had no fantasy or no creativity, said, what do we do with that? Just make. And the thing is that it's the easiest way of just making the money flow. And even if it's not corrupt in the sense of, in the strict sense of the word, it's not providing a benefit to society, And I think that's a very painful thing. Let me ask you, if you had to rate yourself amongst other architects and like maybe try to like imagine on a global level, how far of the curve, how far ahead of the curve are you? And I know you're a humble guy, but I mean it more like, not in a sense like, oh, I'm so far ahead. It's like, but how much more catch up do we need to do? And how can we accelerate catch up amongst other architectural schools and followers of the profession?
So, the number of times that we're told as a team, like that what we do is not architecture, that it's, installations, or it's like, it's not real, or it doesn't measure up to the reality. I can't even count the number of times I was told that. And it's really, it's motivating because I want to prove them wrong. But also I think that it reveals that people have a preconception of what architecture should be, or they have they think they know, when actually architects are very disconnected from the general public and from the economy as well. Like I think in France, only 4% of buildings are made by architects. So you say I'm a humble guy. I think everyone should be humble. Like every architect out there should be the most humble people ever, because their profession is disappearing, and it's being replaced by corporate interest and builders that have like giant kind of contracting companies that are focused on profit. And unless we provide an added value, or unless we can prove our worth to the general public, we will disappear. So it's really important that the architects out there just admit the fact that architecture is not understood and it's disappearing. And number two, it's really important to teach. The only way I can see to change that is, for example, I'm teaching this afternoon a software that helps do holistic design called Grasshopper, and I teach on Wednesday night. Like I teach as much as I can, because I think that's the only way that people can accept things, is if they understand it. Otherwise, they'll just judge it and they'll just reject it. And so architects have to be humble and teach.
Man, the teaching thing is so important.
Yeah.
But it's funny, like a lot of these professions that people, that don't pay very well, especially if you do it at a lower level, are the most vital ones in our society. You start understanding it. And it's funny how very often in society people forget, or they confuse what is priceless with what is worthless.
Yeah.
And by only maximizing, revenue or return on investment, very often things get messed up. And so let me ask you a question. Let's move a little bit to the policy part side of things. And actually, I found out something very interesting from you, is that you actually have a green kind of heritage in you. So why don't you tell us about that and tell us that story?
So, my parents were kind of hippies, I can say. They came from very different background, and they met during the May 68 revolution in France. And my dad really came from as I mentioned, the computer science world, the entrepreneurial world, and my mom came from the ecological world. Like, she was really interested in concepts of ecology and so on. And so they wrote books together, where one of them said how to reconciliate Woodstock and Wall Street, for example.
Wow.
Or one was called Beyond the Bottom Line, where my dad was trying to explain how companies can focus on ethics, and so that it's all up to capitalism to self-impose an ethic that takes into account the environmental cost of things. Because if we let as you say, the financial aspects lead, then we undervalue the environmental impact. And so they took this as a fight, and they created with some friends one of the first ecological political parties in France, called Génération Écologie. Wow. And my mom worked for the Minister of the Environment, and I was doing my internships there, and I was trying to help, and I was like 8 years old or whatever. And then they went to the first Earth Summit in Rio in the 1990s. And so they were always introducing me to amazing people, Sting, Rowney. I even got to meet Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream guys. Yeah. There was a real kind of network of people. They called themselves, I think, the social venture network, because they were former hippies that became rich. And it's like, how can they keep their values or bring their values now that they had power? And there was something really interesting about seeing that capitalism and ecology weren't contradictory. Yes. And this notion was really key to my parents' fight. Yeah.
Well, it's amazing, and it clearly rubbed off on you as well, right?
100%. I think of it all the time. Yeah.
It's lovely. I didn't know. I mean, I had the opportunity of meeting your parents on one of my trips on one of my trips to Paris, when we had couscous with them and everything. It was great. I didn't know that they were so deep into the whole sustainability thing. Yeah. But many of us really see that it's the only future. I mean, and so let me ask you the last question. Because obviously, like at the beginning of the whole talk, we talked about conscientiousness. We talked about really kind of like changing your state of mind. You've been in that up to your neck since you were a child, with your parents and their whole enterprise and their whole thing. So tell me, what needs to happen for this shift to accelerate? Brother, you built the temple at Burning Man, you did Galaxia. I know you're doing your thing. But what inspirational message can you send to others? It's like, what do we need to do this thing to elevate that consciousness?
I think there's a real issue in the way we tackle these topics, which is very blamey. It's very pointing fingery, and I think that people, when you do this, they get immediately a bit protective, and I don't think that's the right way to accelerate it. I don't think telling people off will change people. I think it's only by showing how we do things and to put numbers. People are actually quite sensitive to the scientific proofs, and to actually give a true sense of the environmental cost of what we do through metrics, pure metrics. I know it sounds boring, but by actually being very scientific, it can only be observed that we're doing things wrong. And so I really believe in that. It's through our life, like you say, what we do in the office is we live and breathe it, right? If other places mean it, and if they want to mean it, then they have to do it and show what they do and how they're changing. I think it can only come from the bottom up, from all of us doing things rather than necessarily preaching.
And I agree with you. I agree with you totally. I mean, that's why I'm also involved in this whole project. Arthur, man, thank you very much. It was a beautiful conversation. I'm so grateful. Funnily enough, we were supposed to talk. Yeah, thank you, man. It's like, I thought we were going to talk about human spaces and urban environments, and we ended up talking about humanity, architecture, the future of architecture, and so many things. And so touching on all of these hippie subjects, we talked about about social justice, not so much, but about sustainable development, sustainable enterprise, completely, right? environmental wisdom, completely. Grassroots activism, we just discussed it, you know, people getting involved. And this whole thing of nonviolence, which is actually thinking with your heart and not just with your head. Man, that was really beautiful. It's a lovely conversation.
Thank you.
Again, I remind you that this is the Žaliuoju podcast. You know, I can just say thank you. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the future.
Speak to you soon. And thank you. Thank you very much for that.
All right, brother. Take care.
Ciao. Bye-bye.